dark secrets, forbidden truths, and a relentless quest for justice. What would you do if the legacy of someone you loved put your life in danger? Join us as we unravel the chilling mystery of a woman's battle against corruption, betrayal, and her own fears to uncover a truth that could shake everything. Will she triumph, or will the shadows consume her? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any updates. The rain pattered softly against the window pane, a rhythm so gentle it could have lulled anyone else to sleep. But not Ellie Ashcroft. She sat hunched over her desk, the dim light of a single oil lamp casting long shadows over the open journal in front of her. The scent of old leather and aged paper mingled with the faint aroma of tea gone cold. Ellie's fingers traced the looping, faded script, her heart quickening with each line. "Maggie," she called softly, not lifting her eyes. "Come look at this." Her best friend, Maggie DuPont, shuffled over from the small hearth, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The glow of the fire did little to ease the chill that seemed to linger in Ellie's modest home. "What is it now?" Maggie asked, lowering herself into the chair opposite. Her tone was warm, teasing but tinged with concern. "Another cryptic line about lost fortunes? Or have you found the secret to eternal youth?" Ellie managed to smile, though her focus didn't waver. "It's not just cryptic, it's deliberate. Whoever wrote this didn't want it understood at first glance." She tapped a line with her finger. "Look at this. The shadow stands not in solitude, but in the light it obscures. What do you make of that?" Maggie leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "Sounds like one of those poets you used to read when you were feeling particularly dramatic." Ellie finally looked up, her gray eyes sharp. "It's more than poetry, Maggie. This journal belonged to someone in the Langley household, decades ago. And here," she turned a page, "it talks about the missing gold shipments during the expansion of Langley Holdings." "Ellie," Maggie's voice softened, a rare note of caution entering her tone. "We've talked about this. Poking into the past, it's not always worth the trouble, especially not with someone like Victor Langley." Ellie's jaw tightened. "If no one pokes, Maggie, nothing gets revealed. And people like Langley keep winning." Maggie sighed, reaching across the table to clasp Ellie's hand. Her own hands, worn from years of nursing and tending to others, were warm and steady. "I know why you're doing this," she said quietly, "but don't let it consume you. Not again." Ellie's gaze softened, her thoughts drifting unbidden to Peter, to the way his laugh used to fill their little house, to the cold, crushing silence that had taken his place. She pulled her hand away, turning back to the journal. "It's not about me," she murmured. "Not anymore." The wind howled suddenly, rattling the windows, and both women startled. Ellie's heart raced as she glanced toward the door. The shadows seemed to stretch further now, creeping toward the edges of the room. "Don't tell me you're spooked," Maggie said, forcing a laugh, but her eyes darted to the door too. "Just the wind, Ellie." Ellie nodded, though unease coiled in her chest. She turned another page, her pulse quickening as she uncovered a drawing tucked within the journal, a crude map with a distinct marker circled in red. "What on earth is that?" Maggie leaned in again, her curiosity piqued despite her earlier warning. "A location," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's near the old Langley estate. If I'm right—" Maggie interrupted, shaking her head vehemently. "Ellie, no. I draw the line at you wandering around abandoned estates at night, especially Langley's." Ellie's lips quirked in a small, determined smile. "Then it's a good thing I'm not planning to go at night. Don't be clever with me." Maggie straightened, her hands on her hips. "Promise me you'll think about this first." Ellie hesitated, her fingers brushing over the map. "I promise." Maggie narrowed her eyes, clearly unconvinced. "I mean it, Ellie. This obsession—" "It's not an obsession," Ellie snapped, louder than intended. She softened almost immediately, her voice breaking. "It's Maggie. Someone was silenced. Someone who tried to expose him. I can't just—" She broke off, turning away. Maggie's stern expression melted into one of deep affection. "Ellie, you've always had a heart too big for your own good. Just don't let it break again." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, save for the soft crackle of the fire. Ellie didn't respond, her attention back on the map. But the weight of Maggie's words lingered. As Maggie stood and began clearing the teacups, Ellie whispered to herself, "The shadow stands not in solitude, but in the light it obscures." Her heart thudded in her chest as she realized she wasn't just reading about the past, she was stepping into it. And whatever waited for her at the Langley estate was far from predictable. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the lace curtains of Ellie's study, casting dappled patterns across the scattered papers on her desk. The crude map she had discovered the night before sat at the center, its red circle taunting her with secrets just out of reach. Beside it, the journal lay open, its pages whispering stories that had waited decades to be told. Ellie picked up her magnifying glass, studying the jagged handwriting on the latest page. The words seemed hurried, desperate, as if the author had been racing against time to record their thoughts. "What are you hiding?" Ellie murmured aloud, her voice a mix of curiosity and frustration. Maggie's voice answered from the doorway. "Talking to ghosts again, are we?" Ellie turned to see her friend leaning against the doorframe, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. Maggie's smile was warm, but her eyes carried the weight of last night's conversation. She hadn't slept well. Ellie could tell by the way she cradled the mug, as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I thought you'd gone back to the hospital," Ellie said, gesturing for her friend to come in. "I did," Maggie replied, setting the mugs down, "but I couldn't stop thinking about you and that journal." She sighed, lowering herself into the armchair opposite Ellie. "You've got that look in your eyes again, the one that says you're about to run headfirst into trouble." Ellie gave a small laugh, though her fingers trembled as they turned another page of the journal. "It's not trouble, Maggie. It's justice." "Justice?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Ellie, this isn't some courtroom drama. You're digging up things that were buried for a reason." "Exactly," Ellie countered, her voice sharpening. "Because someone wanted them buried. Someone like Victor Langley." The name hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Maggie took a deep breath, her tone softening. "I know you think this will make a difference," she said. "And maybe it will. But what about you, Ellie? What happens if digging up the past just breaks you all over again?" Ellie looked away, her gaze fixed on the page before her. The silence stretched until Maggie thought she wouldn't answer. But then, quietly, Ellie spoke. "It already has, Maggie. Every day since Peter died, I've been broken. This," she gestured to the journal, her voice trembling, "this is the first time I've felt alive in years. The first time I felt like I can fight back." Maggie reached out, covering Ellie's hand with her own. Her voice was a whisper, thick with emotion. "Then fight, Ellie, but don't fight alone." Ellie swallowed hard, nodding as she squeezed Maggie's hand. The moment hung between them, raw and unspoken, until the shrill sound of the telephone shattered the quiet. Both women jumped. Ellie crossed the room, lifting the receiver with a cautious hand. "Ellie Ashcroft," she said. "Mrs. Ashcroft," came a male voice, smooth and controlled. "I understand you've been looking into some old family matters." Ellie's heart froze. She clutched the phone tighter. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows the value of discretion," the voice replied. "I suggest you learn it quickly. The Langley estate does not take kindly to meddling." The line went dead before Ellie could respond. She lowered the receiver slowly, her hands trembling. "Ellie?" Maggie's voice was sharp with concern. "Who was that?" Ellie turned, her face pale but her eyes blazing with defiance. "A warning," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "From someone who doesn't want me to keep reading." Maggie stood, her jaw set. "Then you'd better read faster." Ellie nodded, returning to the desk. She flipped through the journal, her eyes scanning the pages until one phrase leapt out at her, written in shaky, desperate letters. "They will come for you, just as they came for me. Trust no one." She sat back, the weight of the words pressing down on her. For a moment, doubt crept in, whispering that she was in over her head. But then she thought of Peter, of his smile, his laughter, and the unanswered questions that had haunted her since the day he died. Her resolve hardened. "I'm not stopping," she said aloud, as much to herself as to Maggie. "Not until I know the truth." Maggie crossed her arms, her eyes glinting with a mix of worry and determination. Then I guess we'd better prepare for whatever's coming. The two women shared a look, one of understanding, of unspoken promises. They were stepping into dangerous territory, but neither would turn back now. Ellie turned the page of the journal again, her breath catching as she found another map, this one more detailed than the first. A name was scrawled beside the red circle. Andrew Carter. Maggie leaned over her shoulder. Who's that? Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line. A name I didn't expect to see. She grabbed her coat, determination flashing in her eyes. And someone who might finally give us some answers. As they stepped into the morning light, the shadows of the past stretched long behind them. But Ellie didn't look back. The old Langley estate loomed ahead, its crumbling facade bathed in the pale glow of the crescent moon. Ellie tightened her scarf against the chill creeping through the autumn air, her breath visible in faint white puffs. Maggie stood beside her, shifting nervously, her flashlight trembling in her hand. I can't believe I let you talk me into this, Maggie muttered. Her voice, usually steady with conviction, now wavered with unease. This place looks like it could collapse if you sneeze too hard. Ellie glanced at her friend, a flicker of guilt crossing her features. I didn't ask you to come. No, but you knew I wouldn't let you go alone, Maggie shot back, her eyes narrowing. That's the problem with best friends. We're too loyal for our own good. Ellie almost smiled, but turned her attention back to the task at hand. She unfolded the map she'd found in the journal, the edges worn and soft from years of handling. Her finger traced a path leading to a small outbuilding behind the main estate. According to this, there's a cellar entrance back there, Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's where the journal says they hid whatever it is. They? Maggie's flashlight beam wavered as she scanned the shadowed grounds. Ellie, I swear, if a ghost jumps out at me, I'm haunting you when I die. No ghosts, Ellie replied with forced confidence, though her pulse quickened as the shadows seemed to shift around them. Just answers. The two women moved cautiously, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The estate was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made every creak and rustle feel magnified. Ellie's grip tightened on the small crowbar she'd brought, just in case. Reaching the cellar door, Ellie knelt and brushed away the leaves and dirt that had accumulated over the years. The rusted handle resisted at first, but gave way with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Of course it's stairs, Maggie muttered, her nerves barely concealed beneath her dry humor. Because nothing bad ever happens in basements. Ellie shot her a look before starting down the steps, her flashlight illuminating the damp stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. Maggie followed reluctantly, her grip on Ellie's jacket a clear sign she was seconds from bolting. At the bottom, the space opened into a small room lined with shelves, each one covered in a thick layer of dust. Ellie moved toward a wooden chest in the corner, her heart pounding as she recognized the initials carved into the lid, J.L. Jasper Langley, she whispered, running her fingers over the worn engraving. The journal mentioned him, Victor's brother. Maggie leaned in, her fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. What's inside? Ellie pried the chest open, the hinges screeching in protest. Inside were papers, letters, receipts, and a small black notebook. She carefully lifted the notebook, her hands trembling as she flipped through its pages. It's a ledger, she said, her voice shaking. Names, dates, transactions. This proves it, Maggie. Victor's been laundering money, bribing officials, silencing anyone who got in his way. And now you have proof, a deep voice echoed from the shadows, freezing both women in place. Ellie's flashlight swung toward the sound, revealing a tall figure emerging from the darkness. His face was partially obscured by a scarf, but his eyes burned with cold intensity. Who are you? Ellie demanded, clutching the ledger tightly against her chest. That's not important, the man said, stepping closer. What matters is that you hand over that ledger, now. Maggie moved to stand beside Ellie, her voice shaking but defiant. If you think we're just going to hand it over, you don't know us very well. The man chuckled darkly. Bravery doesn't suit amateurs. You don't know what you're dealing with. And neither do you, Ellie shot back, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. You think you can scare us into silence? You're wrong. She held up the ledger. This is going to expose everything. The man's expression hardened. You have no idea the kind of danger you're inviting. Maybe not, Ellie replied, taking a step back toward the stairs. But I know one thing. You're afraid of what's in here, and that tells me I'm on the right track. With a sharp movement, Ellie grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her toward the stairs. The man lunged, but Maggie swung her flashlight at him, the heavy metal connecting with a sickening thud. He stumbled back, cursing under his breath. Run! Ellie shouted, hauling Maggie up the steps. The two women burst into the open air, the cold night stinging their faces. They didn't stop until they reached the car, slamming the doors shut and locking them with trembling hands. Maggie's breathing was ragged as she clutched the steering wheel. Please tell me we're never doing that again. Ellie, clutching the ledger tightly in her lap, shook her head. We have to, Maggie. Whatever's in here, it's the key to everything. As the car sped away, the estate disappeared into the darkness behind them, but the echoes of what they had uncovered lingered, haunting and unrelenting. Ellie stood in her study, the weight of the ledger in her hands feeling heavier than its physical form. The muffled hum of traffic outside her window was a stark contrast to the storm raging in her mind. Maggie sat across from her, uncharacteristically silent, nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Ellie's voice broke the quiet, trembling under the gravity of her words. This changes everything, Maggie. Maggie set the cup down, the clink against the saucer sharper than intended. You're right, it changes everything, including how much danger you're in. Ellie, that man, he didn't follow us for fun. He meant business. Ellie's gaze remained on the ledger, its pages filled with damning evidence of Victor Langley's corruption. They'll do anything to keep this quiet, she whispered, and I mean to make sure they don't. Maggie exhaled sharply, leaning forward, her tone both pleading and exasperated. And what about you? What happens if they silence you next? I won't lose you too, Ellie. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that gnawed at the edges of resolve. Ellie finally looked up, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of fear and determination. I can't walk away, Maggie, not now. Peter didn't walk away when he had a chance to uncover the truth, and it cost him everything. Her voice cracked, the memory of her late husband washing over her like a tidal wave. If I stop now, his death will have been for nothing. Maggie reached across the table, gripping Ellie's hand tightly. Peter wouldn't want you to throw yourself into the same fire that took him. You're all I've got left, Ellie. Please, think this through. Before Ellie could respond, the sound of shattering glass exploded through the room. Both women screamed, ducking instinctively as shards of the window rained down around them. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint, acrid smell of burning rubber. Ellie scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as her eyes darted toward the street. A black car sped away, its tires screeching against the pavement. They found us, Maggie breathed, her voice shaking. Ellie's mind raced, adrenaline drowning out the fear that clawed at her chest. She grabbed the ledger, clutching it tightly as though it were a lifeline. We need to leave, now! Maggie stared at her, frozen for a moment before nodding. You're right, but where? They'll find us wherever we go. Ellie didn't answer immediately. Her thoughts turned to Andrew Carter, the retired detective whose name had surfaced in the journal. He might be their only chance to stay ahead of whoever was after them. We're going to Andrew Carter's house, Ellie said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. Maggie blinked, stunned. The detective! Ellie, you can't just show up on his doorstep with this mess. I don't have a choice, Ellie replied, grabbing her coat. He's the only one who can help us. As the two women hurried out the door, the chill of the night air bit at their faces. Ellie's car sat parked on the curb, its windows intact, a small miracle amid the chaos. She slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. Maggie climbed in beside her, her knuckles white as she fumbled to fasten her seatbelt. This is insane, Ellie, but if we're doing this, we do it together. Ellie glanced at her, gratitude flickering in her eyes. Always. The drive to Andrew's house was tense. the silence between them punctuated only by the hum of the engine and Maggie's occasional glances over her shoulder. When they finally pulled up to the small brick house on the edge of town, Ellie's breath caught. The house was dark save for a faint light glowing in one of the front windows. Ellie hesitated, her fingers hovering over the door handle. "What if he doesn't believe us?" she asked quietly. Maggie reached over, squeezing Ellie's arm. "Then we make him. You've come too far to turn back now." Ellie nodded, forcing herself to exhale as she stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched underfoot, each step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. She knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. For a moment there was no response. Then the sound of locks turning broke the silence, and the door creaked open to reveal Andrew Carter. His sharp, weathered features softened with surprise as his gaze shifted between Ellie and Maggie. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, his voice rough with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Ellie held up the ledger, her hands steady despite the chaos in her heart. "We need your help, Mr. Carter, and I think you'll want to see this." Andrew's eyes narrowed as he stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "You'd better come in." The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold outside, but it did little to ease the tension in the room. Andrew gestured for them to sit, his expression unreadable as Ellie placed the ledger on the table. "This," she began, her voice firm but trembling at the edges, "is proof that Victor Langley has been bribing officials, laundering money, and worse. Someone tried to stop us from bringing it here." Andrew's gaze hardened, his fingers tracing the edge of the ledger. "And you thought bringing it to me was a good idea? Do you want to help stop him, or are you just going to watch from the sidelines?" Ellie shot back, her frustration bubbling to the surface. For a moment, Andrew said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes dark with something Ellie couldn't quite place. Fear? Regret? "All right," he said finally. "But if we're doing this, you need to know, it's going to get worse before it gets better." Ellie nodded, her jaw set. "I'm ready." Maggie, sitting beside her, muttered under her breath, "I'm not." Andrew's lips quirked in a faint smile, the first sign of warmth he'd shown. "Then let's get to work." Ellie sat at Andrew's kitchen table, the weight of exhaustion pressing on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The ledger lay between them, its damning contents stark against the dull wooden surface. Maggie was pacing in the background, her movements erratic, her frustration simmering just below the surface. "This isn't enough," Andrew said finally, his tone cold and measured. He pushed the ledger away, leaning back in his chair. "Langley's been playing this game for decades. A few pages of incriminating evidence won't even scratch the surface." Ellie's hands clenched into fists. "So what are you saying? That we should just stop?" "I'm saying," Andrew replied sharply, "that we need more. And if you keep charging in like this, you're going to get yourselves killed before you find it." "That's rich coming from the man who sat on this case for years," Ellie snapped, her voice laced with anger and bitterness. "You had a chance to stop him before. Why didn't you?" Andrew's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "You think I don't regret that every day?" he shot back. "I did everything I could with the evidence I had. But people like Langley, they don't just evade justice, they destroy it." Maggie stopped pacing, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough, both of you!" She turned to Ellie, her eyes blazing with anger and worry. "Ellie, you can't keep pushing everyone away. Andrew's trying to help you, even if you're too stubborn to see it." Ellie opened her mouth to argue, but Maggie wasn't finished. "And you," she said, rounding on Andrew, "stop acting like you're the only one who's ever faced regret. We're all in this mess now, whether we like it or not." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Maggie's words settling over them. Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair while Ellie stared down at the ledger, her thoughts racing. "I know this is personal for you," Andrew said after a long pause, his tone softer now. "But if we're going to take Langley down, we need to be smart about it. We can't afford mistakes." Ellie nodded slowly, her voice quiet but firm. "Then help me find what we're missing." Andrew hesitated, his gaze lingering on Ellie's determined expression. Finally, he nodded. "There's someone who might be able to help. An old informant of mine. He worked with Langley's crew years ago. If anyone knows where the skeletons are buried, it's him. Ellie's heart leapt at the prospect of a lead, but Andrew's next words tempered her hope. But he won't talk easily. He's got as much to lose as Langley does if this comes to light. Then we give him a reason to talk, Ellie said, her resolve hardening. I'm not backing down. Maggie sighed, rubbing her temples. And here I thought tonight would end with tea and blankets, not another wild goose chase. Andrew cracked a faint smile, the tension in the room easing ever so slightly. You'll get your tea when this is over, Maggie. But for now, we've got work to do. As the three of them began to strategize, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a razor's edge. Every step brought them closer to the truth, and closer to the danger that shadowed it. The dimly lit cafe buzzed softly with the hum of low conversations and the clink of china cups against saucers. Ellie sat in the corner, her back to the wall, eyes scanning the room. Andrew had insisted on meeting his informant here, claiming it was neutral ground. But neutral didn't mean safe. Maggie fidgeted beside her, glancing toward the door every few seconds. This guy's late, she muttered, her voice low. You sure he's even coming? Andrew, standing by the window, gave her a pointed look. He'll be here. He's cautious, not unreliable. Ellie kept her gaze steady, her hands resting on the folder she'd brought. Inside were copies of the ledger pages, just enough to spark interest, but not enough to jeopardize everything if the meeting went wrong. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and a man entered. He was wiry, with a face weathered by years of worry and survival. His eyes darted around the room before landing on Andrew. With a nod of recognition, he approached their table. This is him, Andrew murmured, moving to sit beside Ellie as the man took a seat across from them. You're cutting it close, Maggie said sharply, earning a nudge from Ellie. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I don't take chances anymore. Not with the kind of trouble you're stirring up. Ellie leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Thank you for meeting us, Mr. Lacey. We need your help. Lacey snorted, shaking his head. Help? You don't need my help. You need a way out before Langley buries you in the same grave he put the others. The word sent a shiver down Ellie's spine, but she held her ground. We have evidence, real evidence, tying him to money laundering, bribery, and worse, but it's not enough. We need the missing pieces, and you're the only one who can give them to us. Lacey's gaze flicked to the folder on the table. Evidence, huh? Let me see. Ellie hesitated, then slid the folder across to him. He opened it, his expression guarded as he flipped through the pages. When he spoke again, his tone was bitter. You don't know what you're dealing with. Langley's not just some corrupt businessman. He's a predator. He knows how to make people disappear quietly, efficiently. You think you're safe because you have this? He held up the pages. You're not. Andrew's jaw tightened, his voice steady but tense. We're not here to argue. If you have something that can help us, now's the time to speak up. Lacey hesitated, his fingers tapping against the folder. There's a warehouse, he said finally. Langley used it years ago to store things he didn't want anyone to find. I don't know if it's still active, but if you're looking for the skeletons, that's where you'll find them. Where is it? Ellie asked, her pulse quickening. Lacey rattled off an address, his eyes narrowing. But I'm telling you now, it's not worth it. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish, it won't bring back the dead. The words hit Ellie like a punch to the chest. Her breath caught, and for a moment the cafe faded around her, replaced by the memory of Peter's smile. She forced herself to focus, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not about bringing them back. It's about making sure no one else suffers the same fate. Lacey leaned back, studying her with a mixture of pity and respect. You've got guts, lady. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you when Langley comes for you. Ellie didn't flinch. Then I guess I'll just have to be faster than him. A tense silence fell over the table before Lacey stood abruptly. I've said my piece. You want to chase ghosts? Be my guest. But don't say I didn't warn you. He walked away without another word, disappearing into the night. Maggie let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Well, that was fun, she said, her voice strained. What now? Ellie stood, her resolve hardening. Now, we go to the warehouse. Andrew frowned. Not tonight. We need to plan. Make sure we're not walking into a trap. There's no time, Ellie shot back. Langley's already one step ahead of us. If we wait, we'll lose the chance to find whatever's there. Andrew hesitated, glancing between Ellie and Maggie. Fine, he said finally, but we do this my way. No reckless moves. Ellie nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead. The past wasn't going to stay buried forever, not if she had anything to say about it. The air inside the warehouse was cold and damp, each breath forming a faint mist in the dim light of their flashlights. Ellie led the way, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick dust coating the floor. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the building a reminder of the danger lurking just out of sight. Are we even sure this is the right place? Maggie whispered, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. Her voice was barely audible, but the tension in it was palpable. Ellie paused, holding up a hand to quiet her friend. Lacey wouldn't have given us bad information, she replied softly. If this is where Langley kept his secrets, we'll find something. Andrew, who had been scanning the walls for any signs of a hidden compartment, turned toward them. Stay focused. We don't know who else might show up. Ellie moved forward again, her flashlight beam catching on a series of crates stacked haphazardly in the corner. Her heart skipped as she approached, the years of abandonment evident in the cobwebs and rusted locks. She knelt, brushing off the grime to reveal faint stenciled letters, L&C Holdings. This is it, Ellie said, her voice trembling with a mix of anticipation and dread. These belong to Langley's company. Andrew crouched beside her, his brow furrowed. Careful, he warned, pulling out a crowbar to pry open the first crate. The wood groaned in protest before splitting apart, revealing stacks of yellowed papers and ledgers inside. Maggie hovered nearby, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. What are we even looking for? More records? We already have enough of those. Something tangible, Ellie replied, rifling through the papers. Something that ties him directly to the crimes. The second crate revealed more documents, but tucked among them was a sealed envelope with no markings. Ellie's hands shook as she opened it, revealing a photograph inside. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Maggie leaned over her shoulder. What is it? The photo was black and white, slightly faded but unmistakable. It showed a younger Victor Langley standing beside a man Ellie recognized immediately, her late husband, Peter. The two were shaking hands in front of a construction site, their expressions carefully neutral. Andrew took the photo, his eyes narrowing. This doesn't make sense. Why would Peter be involved with Langley? Ellie felt the world tilt beneath her, her knees weak as she clutched the edge of the crate for support. He never mentioned knowing Langley, she stammered, her voice breaking. Why wouldn't he tell me? Maggie placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. Ellie, this doesn't mean he was involved. Peter was a journalist. Maybe he was investigating him. Ellie's mind raced, memories of late nights and half-explained absences flooding back. But why didn't he tell me? She whispered, tears pricking her eyes. He told me everything. Andrew stood, scanning the room with renewed urgency. Whatever this means, Langley's connection to Peter is exactly what he's trying to bury. And if he knew Peter was digging, it might explain. He stopped, his words hanging heavy in the air. Ellie's stomach churned as the unspoken truth settled over them. You think Langley had something to do with Peter's death, she said flatly, her voice barely audible. Andrew didn't answer immediately, his expression grim. It's possible. Ellie turned back to the crates, her hands trembling as she searched for more clues. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the revelation threatening to crush her. Maggie knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Ellie, Maggie said softly, her voice cracking, whatever we find here, you need to know. Peter loved you. That much is undeniable. Whatever he was involved in, he did it to protect you. Ellie nodded, unable to speak as tears streamed down her face. The photograph burned in her hands, a bridge between the man she loved and the shadow of the truth she now had to face. A sudden noise shattered the moment, a loud crash from the other end of the warehouse. Andrew was on his feet in an instant, motioning for silence. Ellie and Maggie froze, their hearts pounding as heavy footsteps echoed toward them. We need to move, Andrew hissed, his hand hovering near the concealed holster at his hip. Ellie grabbed the photograph and a handful of papers, stuffing them into her bag. Maggie clung to her arm as they followed Andrew toward the exit. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a voice called out from the shadows. "Leaving so soon?" Ellie's blood ran cold as a figure emerged into the dim light, a tall man in a long coat, his face partially obscured, but his voice unmistakable. Victor Langley. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as Victor Langley's silhouette loomed in the dim light of the warehouse. His voice, smooth and laced with menace, cut through the heavy air. "You've been busy, Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, stepping closer, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. "Digging through things best left buried." Maggie's grip on Ellie's arm tightened. Andrew moved subtly to place himself between the women and Langley, his hand resting on the weapon concealed beneath his coat. "You've got a lot to answer for, Langley," Andrew said, his voice steady but charged. "What are you doing here?" Langley smiled, cold and calculating. "Merely tying up loose ends. I didn't expect the past to come knocking so boldly." His eyes flicked to Ellie, his tone hardening. "But here you are." Ellie forced herself to speak, her voice trembling but defiant. "You think you can silence the truth? That ledger, those crates, they're going to expose everything." Langley chuckled darkly, his composure unshaken. "The truth, Mrs. Ashcroft, is a matter of perspective, and I've been shaping that perspective for years." He took another step forward, his shadow stretching over them. Maggie instinctively pulled Ellie back, her voice low and urgent. "Ellie, we need to get out of here." "Not without the evidence," Ellie whispered, her determination unyielding despite the fear coursing through her. Langley's smile faltered as he caught sight of the bag slung over Ellie's shoulder. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," he said, his tone sharp and venomous. "This isn't just about me. It's bigger than you can imagine." Andrew's stance shifted, his voice cutting through the tension. "We'll let the authorities decide how big it is. Your time's up, Langley." Langley's expression darkened, and he raised his hand. Behind him, two men stepped out of the shadows, their imposing figures illuminated by the faint glow of a flashlight. Ellie's heart raced. "Andrew," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "I see them," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he gauged their next move. "Stay behind me." Langley's men advanced, and Andrew pulled out his weapon, his voice firm. "That's close enough." For a moment the room held its breath, the tension suffocating. Then Langley's voice, calm and assured, shattered the stillness. "You're outnumbered, Carter. This won't end the way you think." But before Langley's men could close the distance, Maggie grabbed a loose metal pipe from the floor and swung it at a stack of crates nearby. The crash echoed through the warehouse as the crates toppled, scattering papers and debris across the floor. The sudden noise startled Langley's men, and Andrew seized the opportunity. "Run!" Andrew barked, shoving Ellie and Maggie toward the exit. The three of them bolted, their footsteps pounding against the concrete as Langley shouted behind them. "Stop them now!" Ellie's lungs burned as she sprinted, clutching the bag tightly. Maggie struggled to keep up, her face pale but determined. They reached the door just as Langley's men gained on them. Andrew turned, firing a warning shot that ricocheted off a metal beam. The sound was deafening, and Langley's men hesitated, giving the group just enough time to escape into the night. The cold air hit them like a wall as they burst out of the warehouse. Andrew led them toward a parked car, fumbling with the keys. "Get in now!" Ellie and Maggie scrambled into the back seat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Andrew started the car and sped away, the tires screeching as they rounded the corner. In the rearview mirror, Ellie saw Langley's men emerging from the warehouse, their figures growing smaller as the car sped into the darkness. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by Maggie's shaky voice. "That was too close." Andrew's grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw clenched. "We're not safe yet. Langley doesn't give up that easily." Ellie sat back, her heart pounding as she clutched the bag to her chest. The photograph of Peter seemed to burn through the fabric, a reminder of the stakes they faced. "This isn't just about Langley," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "He said it himself. It's bigger than him." Maggie turned to her, her eyes wide with fear. "Ellie, what if he's right? What if we're in over our heads?" Ellie shook her head, her expression resolute. Then we fight harder. We've come too far to turn back now. Andrew glanced at her in the mirror, a flicker of respect in his weary eyes. Let's just make it through tonight first. As they drove into the safety of the city, the shadows of the warehouse seemed to follow them, whispering threats that lingered in the cold night air. The Langley estate glowed faintly in the pale morning light, a veneer of elegance masking the rot beneath. Inside, the air was thick with tension as Victor Langley stood by the fireplace, his back turned to his daughter Charlotte. The faint crackle of the flames was the only sound in the room, though the weight of unspoken words pressed heavily on them both. Charlotte shifted in her seat, her hands twisting the hem of her silk blouse. "Father," she began, her voice unsteady, "we need to talk." Victor didn't turn. "If this is about your ridiculous notions of justice, spare me the lecture, Charlotte." Her stomach twisted at his dismissive tone, but she forced herself to press on. "It's not just notions. I've seen the evidence. I know what you've done." At that, Victor turned, his gaze sharp and cutting. "What you think you know is dangerous for both of us." Charlotte stood, her knees trembling but her resolve firm. "No, Father. What's dangerous is pretending you can keep hiding this. Ellie Ashcroft has the proof and she won't stop." Victor's face darkened, and he took a step closer, his voice low and cold. "You've been speaking to her, haven't you?" Charlotte hesitated, her silence betraying her. Victor's jaw tightened, the betrayal stark in his eyes. "After everything I've done for this family, you would side with her?" "I'm not siding with anyone." Charlotte's voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm trying to do what's right, don't you see? It doesn't have to end like this. You can—" Victor slammed his hand down on the mantel, silencing her. "Enough. You have no idea what I've sacrificed, what I've endured to keep this family where it belongs." "Endured?" Charlotte's voice rose, anger finally breaking through her fear. "You call lying and manipulating endurance? You've destroyed lives, Father. Do you even care?" Victor's eyes blazed as he stepped closer, his towering presence casting a shadow over her. "Care? Everything I've done has been for you, for this family, and you repay me with betrayal?" Tears slipped down Charlotte's cheeks, but she didn't back down. "This isn't about family, it's about power, and I won't be complicit anymore." Victor's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? What you're risking?" "I'm risking the truth, Father," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "And if that means going against you, then so be it." For a long moment, Victor stared at her, the firelight reflecting in his cold, calculating eyes. Then slowly he straightened, his expression hardening into something unrecognizable. "You've made your choice, Charlotte, but don't think for a second that I'll let you ruin everything I've built." She flinched at his words, but her resolve didn't waver. "And I won't let you destroy anyone else." Without another word, Charlotte turned and walked out of the room, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and defiance. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. For the first time, she was truly alone. Hours later, Charlotte stood in the shadows of Ellie's modest home, her fingers poised over the doorbell. Her father's words echoed in her mind, but so did the faces of those whose lives he had destroyed. She couldn't turn back now. The door opened before she could press the bell, revealing Ellie's weary but alert face. Surprise flashed in her eyes as she recognized Charlotte. "Charlotte," Ellie's voice was wary. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting her father to appear at any moment. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere private." Ellie stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. Maggie appeared in the doorway to the living room, her expression shifting to one of suspicion when she saw their guest. "What's she doing here?" Maggie asked, her tone sharp. "She's here to talk," Ellie replied, her gaze fixed on Charlotte. "Let's hear her out." Charlotte hesitated, her nerves threatening to betray her. But then she met Ellie's steady gaze and drew a deep breath. "I want to help you," she said finally. "I have information about my father, things you'll need if you're going to stop him." Ellie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why now? Why come to us after everything?" Tears glistened in Charlotte's eyes as she spoke. "Because I can't live with this anymore. I can't live knowing what he's done and what he's still capable of." Maggie crossed her arms, her skepticism evident. How do we know this isn't some kind of trap? It's not, Charlotte said quickly, her voice breaking. You have no reason to trust me, but I need you to. Please. Ellie studied her for a long moment, her own emotions warring within her. Finally, she nodded. All right, tell us everything. Charlotte sank into the nearest chair, relief mingling with dread. As she began to speak, the weight of her decision pressed heavily on her. But for the first time in her life, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The tiny apartment was tucked away in the corner of a forgotten street, its exterior cracked and worn by years of neglect. Andrew knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing down the dimly lit hallway. Ellie stood beside him, clutching her notebook tightly, while Maggie lingered a step behind, her unease evident in her darting eyes. You sure he's here? Maggie asked, her voice low but tense. This place feels like it hasn't seen life in decades. Andrew nodded, his expression unreadable. He's here, trust me. The door creaked open, revealing a man whose face bore the weight of years spent looking over his shoulder. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, flitted nervously between Andrew and the women. Carter, the man rasped, his voice roughened by time and cigarettes. I thought I told you to leave me out of this. We don't have time for games, Jacob, Andrew replied, his tone firm but measured. You know why we're here. Jacob's gaze shifted to Ellie and Maggie, suspicion etched into every line of his face. Who are they? Ellie stepped forward, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. I'm Ellie Ashcroft. My husband, Peter Ashcroft, was investigating Langley before he died. I think you know something that could help us stop him. At the mention of Langley, Jacob visibly stiffened, his hand gripping the edge of the door. I don't know anything, he muttered, beginning to close the door. Leave me alone. Ellie reacted instinctively, placing her hand on the door to stop it. Please, she said, desperation bleeding into her voice. If you don't help us, more people are going to get hurt. Don't let Langley win again. Jacob hesitated, his eyes meeting Ellie's. Something in her expression, maybe the pain, maybe the determination, caused his resolve to falter. With a sigh, he opened the door wider and stepped aside. 5 minutes, he said gruffly. That's all you get. The inside of the apartment was as bleak as its exterior. The air was stale, and the only light came from a single lamp in the corner. Jacob motioned for them to sit, then slumped into a chair, rubbing his face with trembling hands. You're wasting your time, he began, his voice hollow. Langley's untouchable. He's got everyone in his pocket, judges, cops, even some of your so-called investigative journalists. Ellie leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. But you're not in his pocket anymore, are you? That's why he wanted you gone. Jacob's laugh was bitter, his teeth clenched. He didn't want me gone, he wanted me erased, and he almost succeeded. Andrew crossed his arms, his voice calm but insistent. Then why are you still here, Jacob? Why not disappear completely? Jacob's hand trembled as he reached for a pack of cigarettes on the table. He lit one, taking a long drag before exhaling a plume of smoke. Because some things you can't outrun, he admitted. I saw what Langley did, what he's still doing, and every day I wake up wondering if I should have done more to stop him. Ellie's throat tightened, her voice soft but urgent. You still can. Whatever you know, whatever you saw, it could make all the difference. Jacob shook his head, his voice tinged with regret. You don't get it, do you? It's not just about Langley. He's just one piece of the puzzle. There are others, people more powerful than him, pulling the strings. If you go after him, you'll be poking the whole damn nest. Andrew's jaw clenched, his frustration evident. We're not asking you to take them all down. Just give us something, anything that ties Langley directly to his crimes. Jacob fell silent, the weight of the request pressing down on him. Finally, he stood and shuffled to a cabinet in the corner. From within, he pulled out a small, battered envelope and handed it to Ellie. These, he said quietly, are copies of the contracts Langley used to bribe officials. Names, dates, amounts. It's all there. But it's not enough to convict him outright. You'll need more. Ellie opened the envelope, her breath hitching as she saw the damning evidence inside. She looked up at Jacob, her voice breaking. Why didn't you come forward with this sooner? Because I'm a coward, Jacob admitted, his voice raw. Because I knew what would happen if I did. Maggie, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're not a coward, Jacob. You're still here, and you're still fighting in your own way. That takes more courage than you realize. Jacob's gaze softened, and for a moment, the room was filled with a heavy, shared understanding. Then he turned to Andrew, his expression hardening. Get out of here before I change my mind. And for God's sake, be careful. Andrew nodded, guiding Ellie and Maggie toward the door. As they left, Ellie glanced back at Jacob, her heart aching for the man who had been trapped in Langley's shadow for so long. Outside, the cold air hit them like a slap. Ellie clutched the envelope tightly, her determination renewed. We're getting closer, she said, her voice steady. Langley's time is running out. Andrew glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Then let's make it count. The soft hum of machinery echoed faintly as Ellie, Andrew, and Maggie descended into the old municipal tunnels beneath the city. The air was damp and heavy, the faint scent of mold clinging to every breath. Ellie tightened her grip on the flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the oppressive darkness ahead. This place gives me the creeps, Maggie muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at the crumbling walls, the faint graffiti scrawled in forgotten corners. Why would Langley stash anything down here? Andrew led the way, his posture tense but deliberate. Because no one would think to look, he replied. And those who do usually don't make it out to tell anyone. Ellie shivered, though it wasn't just the cold. The envelope Jacob had given her was tucked securely in her bag, its contents rattling in her mind. Contracts, names, dates. They were damning, yes, but incomplete. She needed more, and Jacob's cryptic suggestion that Langley's most incriminating secrets were hidden underground had brought them here. Do you even know what we're looking for? Maggie pressed, her anxiety rising with every step. No, Ellie admitted, her voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. But if Jacob was right, we'll know it when we see it. Andrew stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal silence. He shone his flashlight ahead, revealing a rusted metal door half hidden by a pile of debris. This might be it, he said, his voice low. Help me clear this. Ellie and Maggie moved to his side, pushing aside the rubble with trembling hands. The air grew colder as they worked, and every scrape of metal against stone seemed deafening in the stillness. When the door was finally exposed, Andrew tested the handle. It resisted at first, but with a sharp tug it creaked open, revealing a small chamber beyond. The room was eerily pristine, a stark contrast to the decay outside. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their labels faded but legible. A single table stood in the center, papers scattered across its surface as if someone had left in a hurry. This is it, Ellie whispered, stepping inside. Her flashlight illuminated the nearest cabinet, and she began opening drawers with frantic precision. Maggie stayed close, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows. Andrew moved to the table, his flashlight catching on a folder marked Project Synthesis. He opened it, his breath hitching as he scanned the contents. Ellie, you need to see this. She joined him, her hands trembling as she took the folder. Inside were blueprints, correspondence, and photographs, evidence of a sprawling operation involving shell companies, offshore accounts, and the construction of facilities in remote locations. It's bigger than we thought, Ellie murmured, her voice heavy with realization. Langley wasn't just laundering money, he was funding something. Andrew nodded grimly. And whatever it is, it's not legitimate. Maggie approached, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. So now we have even more questions. Great. How does this help us stop him? Ellie didn't answer immediately, her mind racing as she flipped through the folder. One photograph caught her attention, a group of men standing in front of a nondescript building. Langley was among them, but her gaze fixed on another familiar face. Peter, she breathed, her voice breaking. Maggie leaned over her shoulder, her eyes widening. Is that? Ellie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The photograph was dated 6 months before Peter's death. He'd been there, involved in whatever Langley was orchestrating. Her heart twisted with a mixture of grief and determination. Before she could dwell further, a sound echoed from the corridor, A faint shuffle followed by the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Andrew spun toward the door, his own weapon drawn. "We're not alone," he said sharply. Ellie's pulse quickened as she extinguished her flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. Maggie stifled a gasp, her hand gripping Ellie's arm like a vice. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and unhurried. A shadow moved in the doorway, and a low voice called out, "You've gone too far this time, Mrs. Ashcroft." Langley. Ellie's blood turned to ice, but Andrew didn't hesitate. "Stay behind me," he hissed, positioning himself between them and the entrance. "Do you really think you can walk out of here with my secrets?" Langley continued, his tone calm but dripping with menace. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with." "I understand enough," Ellie shot back, her voice steady despite her fear. "And I won't stop until the world knows the truth." Langley's laugh was cold, echoing off the walls. "Then I suppose we'll have to see who survives long enough to tell it." The room tensed, the air thick with the promise of confrontation. Ellie's heart pounded as she clutched the folder, its contents now more valuable and more dangerous than ever. The distant hum of approaching footsteps sent chills down Ellie's spine as she clutched the folder tighter to her chest. The room was a suffocating cocoon of silence, broken only by the steady, predatory rhythm of Langley's approach. Andrew motioned for Maggie and Ellie to move further into the shadows of the chamber, his weapon drawn and his body coiled like a spring. "Stay low," he murmured, his voice a razor-thin whisper. "No sudden movements." Ellie nodded, her breath shallow as she crouched behind the table, Maggie gripping her arm like a lifeline. The light from Langley's flashlight sliced through the dark corridor, illuminating the edges of the room like the slow crawl of an encroaching storm. "You think you've uncovered something big, don't you?" Langley's voice carried through the gloom, calm and composed, but with an undercurrent of cold menace. "This isn't a game, Mrs. Ashcroft. This is a war, and you are hopelessly outmatched." Ellie's fingers brushed the edge of the photograph of Peter, her resolve hardening. She refused to let Langley's threats shake her, not when she was closer than ever to the truth. Maggie whispered in her ear, her voice trembling, "Ellie, we need a plan. Now." Andrew's voice came from the shadows, calm but unyielding. "The only plan is to hold your ground." Langley stepped fully into the room, his tall frame dominating the space. He held a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other, his expression inscrutable. Behind him, two of his men hovered like sentinels, their own weapons at the ready. "Put the gun down, Carter," Langley said, his voice sharp. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." Andrew didn't move, his gun steady in his hand. "You're right, it doesn't. Walk away, Langley." Langley's laughter was low and humorless. "Walk away? You have no idea who you're dealing with, do you? The people I work with, the power I hold, it's not something you can undo with a few stolen files." "And yet," Ellie said, standing abruptly from her hiding spot, her voice trembling but fierce. "Here we are." Maggie gasped, pulling at Ellie's arm, but she shrugged her off, stepping into the dim light. Langley's gaze fixed on her, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation. "You're brave, Mrs. Ashcroft," Langley said, lowering his gun slightly. "I'll give you that, but bravery doesn't equal intelligence." Ellie took a step closer, holding up the folder. "This doesn't just implicate you, Langley. It implicates everyone you've ever worked with. This is bigger than you, bigger than me, and it's going to bring you down." Langley's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his gun. "You think you can stop this machine? You don't even understand the wheels you've set in motion." Andrew moved quickly, positioning himself between Ellie and Langley, his weapon still raised. "If you're so powerful, why are you here, Langley? Why not let your machine handle it?" Langley's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, a crack in his carefully constructed mask. "Because sometimes, Carter, loose ends require personal attention." Maggie's voice cut through the tension, high-pitched and raw. "You're just a coward hiding behind threats. You think you can scare us into silence? We're not afraid of you." Ellie's heart ached at the quaver in Maggie's voice, but her friend's words were enough to break the stalemate. Langley raised his weapon fully, his men stepping forward as if on command. "Enough!" Langley barked, his composure fracturing. "Give me the files or none of you leave this room." Ellie's hands shook, but her voice remained steady. You can't stop the truth, Langley. Even if you kill us, someone else will find this. Someone else will bring you down. For a moment, the room was frozen, time stretching unbearably as Langley considered her words. Then, without warning, the sound of a scuffle echoed from the hallway outside. Shouts and hurried footsteps followed, drawing Langley's attention. "What the—" he began, turning his head toward the door. Andrew seized the moment, lunging at Langley and knocking his weapon to the ground. Ellie ducked as the room erupted into chaos. Langley's men scrambled, trying to regain control, but Andrew moved with precision, disarming one and sending the other crashing into a stack of cabinets. Maggie grabbed Ellie, pulling her toward the back exit. "Come on!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. Ellie clutched the folder, her heart pounding as they stumbled into the dark corridor. Behind them, Langley's furious voice echoed, followed by a single gunshot that sent sparks flying from the metal doorframe near Maggie's head. "Keep moving!" Andrew's voice barked from behind them, his tone urgent. The three of them burst into the cold night air, their breaths visible in the faint glow of the streetlights. Ellie collapsed against the wall of the alley, clutching the files to her chest as tears streamed down her face. Maggie knelt beside her, her own face pale and streaked with dirt. "Ellie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Ellie nodded shakily, her words choked with emotion. "We're not done yet." Andrew stood at the mouth of the alley, his silhouette sharp against the light. "No," he said grimly, "but we just made a very powerful enemy." Ellie met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "Then let's finish this." The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Andrew's safe house, casting long, fractured shadows across the table where Ellie sat. The scattered evidence spread before her seemed to pulse with life. Pages of contracts, photographs, and blueprints whispering secrets of a sprawling empire built on lies and blood. Yet one piece was still missing, and without it, their fight felt like a losing battle. Maggie entered from the kitchen, setting down a steaming mug of tea. "You've been staring at those papers for hours, Ellie. You need a break." Ellie didn't look up, her fingers tracing the edges of a faded photograph. It was Peter, standing beside Langley, his expression guarded but resolute. "There's something I'm missing," she murmured. "Peter must have known. He was so careful. He wouldn't have left me without a way to finish what he started." Andrew leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "If he left you something, it's not here. We've combed through every inch of this evidence." Ellie's brow furrowed, her mind racing. Then it has to be somewhere else. Something personal. Something he knew only I'd understand. Maggie sighed, pulling a chair beside her. "Ellie, are you sure you're not chasing ghosts? I mean, maybe it's just not there." Ellie's gaze snapped to Maggie, her voice sharp. "It has to be, Maggie. He wouldn't have risked his life for nothing." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Andrew cleared his throat, stepping forward. "What about his office? Or somewhere he went off and something he might have kept hidden?" Ellie froze, her breath catching. Her mind darted back to a memory she hadn't thought of in years. Peter, sitting at the piano in their living room, his fingers gliding over the keys with an effortless grace. She had always teased him for using the piano as his thinking space. "The piano," Ellie said suddenly, her voice trembling. "He loved that piano. If he hid anything, it would be there." Maggie exchanged a worried glance with Andrew. "Ellie, your house isn't exactly safe right now. Langley's men—" "I don't care," Ellie interrupted, her voice firm. "If that's where it is, we have to go." Andrew nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we move fast. No mistakes." The air was thick with tension as they pulled up to Ellie's house. It looked the same as always, its white shutters slightly crooked, the porch in need of repair. But to Ellie, it felt like stepping into enemy territory. Every shadow, every creak seemed to hold the promise of danger. Andrew led the way, his weapon drawn, his sharp gaze scanning every corner. "Stay close," he murmured, motioning for Ellie and Maggie to follow. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the familiar creaks of the floorboards under their feet amplifying the silence. Ellie's heart raced as she moved toward the piano, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. It was as pristine as Peter had left it, the ivory keys untouched since his death. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Peter," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. What were you trying to tell me? Maggie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're here, Ellie. You can do this. Taking a deep breath, Ellie pressed a key. The sound rang out, sharp and clear, then another and another. Her fingers moved instinctively, playing the simple melody Peter had composed years ago, a melody that had once filled their home with warmth. As the last note faded, a faint click echoed from inside the piano. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. Andrew stepped closer, motioning for her to step back as he carefully examined the piano. Lifting a hidden panel beneath the keys, he revealed a small compartment. Inside was a notebook, its leather cover worn but intact. Ellie reached for it, her hands trembling as she opened the first page. Peter's handwriting greeted her, neat and deliberate. If you're reading this, Ellie, it means I couldn't finish what I started. But you can. This notebook contains everything, names, places, details I couldn't put in the articles. Trust no one, not even the authorities. Use this wisely. I love you always. Ellie's vision blurred with tears as she clutched the notebook to her chest. Maggie knelt beside her, tears streaming down her own face. He left it for you, she whispered. He knew you'd find it. Andrew's voice was steady but grim. This is what we needed. With this, we can take Langley down. Ellie wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. Then let's finish this. But before they could move, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the fragile moment. Andrew motioned for silence, peering through the window. His face darkened. Langley, he hissed. Ellie's grip tightened on the notebook. Her fear threatened to overwhelm her, but Peter's words echoed in her mind. You can finish this, Maggie whispered. What do we do now? Ellie met Andrew's gaze, her voice steady. We fight. The hum of Langley's car engine ceased abruptly, the silence outside as heavy as the tension within the house. Ellie gripped the notebook tightly, her breath shallow as she turned to Andrew. His jaw was set, his eyes cold and calculating. They're here, Andrew whispered, peering through the gap in the curtains. 2 cars, 4 men at least. Maggie stifled a gasp, her knuckles white as she clutched Ellie's arm. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely audible. Andrew turned, his voice calm but firm. We hold our ground. Ellie, Maggie, stay low. If they come in shooting, you move toward the back exit. Ellie shook her head, her voice trembling but resolute. I'm not running, Andrew. Not with this. She held up the notebook, her grip unrelenting. This is the proof we need. I won't let him take it. Andrew hesitated, his gaze softening for a moment. Then we make sure he doesn't. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel drew closer, a deliberate rhythm that sent chills down Ellie's spine. Langley's voice carried through the still air, calm and confident. Mrs. Ashcroft, let's not make this any harder than it needs to be. Hand over the notebook and we can all walk away from this. Ellie's heart raced, but she forced herself to reply. Do you really think I'd trust a word you say, Langley? His laugh was low and mocking. Trust has nothing to do with it, my dear. This is about survival. Yours to be specific. Andrew motioned for silence, his finger to his lips as he positioned himself near the front door. The first knock came moments later, sharp and impatient. You have one chance to open this door, Langley said, his tone hardening. After that, I can't guarantee what happens next. Ellie's hand brushed against Maggie's, their shared fear palpable. Maggie whispered, her voice quivering. We're not walking out of here, are we? Ellie turned to her, her eyes brimming with determination. We will. Together. The second knock was followed by a loud crash as Langley's men forced the door open. Andrew fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the confined space. The men hesitated, their weapons drawn, but Langley's voice urged them forward. Find the notebook, he barked. Leave no stone unturned. Chaos erupted as the men fanned out through the house. Andrew took cover behind a table, his precise shots keeping the intruders at bay. Ellie and Maggie crouched low behind the piano, the notebook clutched tightly in Ellie's hands. One of Langley's men spotted them, his gun trained on their hiding spot. Maggie let out a cry, but before he could fire, Andrew's shot rang out, sending him crumpling to the floor. Stay down, Andrew shouted, his voice cutting through the din. Langley stepped into the room, his presence commanding despite the chaos. He locked eyes with Ellie, his expression a mixture of fury and frustration. Enough of this, he snarled. You're only prolonging the inevitable. Ellie stood, her hands trembling but her resolve unshaken. "You can't scare me, Langley. You're not invincible." Langley's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You're brave, Mrs. Ashcroft, but bravery won't save you." He raised his gun and time seemed to slow. Ellie's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. But before Langley could pull the trigger, Andrew lunged at him, knocking the weapon from his hand. The two men grappled, their struggle fierce and brutal. Ellie scrambled to her feet, clutching the notebook as Maggie pulled her toward the back door. "Come on, Ellie," Maggie pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "We have to go." But Ellie hesitated, her gaze fixed on Andrew as he fought to subdue Langley. He glanced back at her, his voice urgent. "Get out of here, now!" Tears blurred her vision, but Ellie nodded, gripping Maggie's hand as they bolted toward the exit. The sound of gunfire and shouts faded behind them as they burst into the cold night air. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the car. Ellie fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as she started the engine. Maggie sobbed quietly beside her, her face buried in her hands. Ellie's voice was soft but firm as she gripped the wheel, her resolve burning brighter than ever. "This isn't over." The grand courtroom was silent, its atmosphere thick with anticipation. Rows of spectators, reporters, and officials filled the wooden benches, their eyes fixed on the polished mahogany doors at the back of the room. Ellie sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The notebook rested before her, its worn leather cover a silent testament to the journey that had led her here. Maggie sat beside her, her presence a quiet but steady comfort. Andrew stood behind them, his arms crossed and his gaze unwavering as he scanned the room. He was a sentinel, ready for anything. Ellie took a deep breath, her nerves coiled like a spring. This was it, the moment she had been fighting for, the moment Peter's voice would finally be heard. The doors swung open, and Victor Langley entered, flanked by his team of lawyers. His expression was calm, his suit impeccable, but Ellie saw the flicker of unease in his eyes as he took his seat at the defense table. For all his bravado, he knew the weight of the evidence stacked against him. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet before settling back into tense silence. The proceedings began, and the prosecutor stood to deliver the opening statement. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we bring before you not just a man, but a system, an intricate web of corruption, greed, and exploitation. Victor Langley has operated with impunity for decades, but today, thanks to the courage of individuals like Mrs. Ellie Ashcroft, the truth can finally come to light." Ellie's heart swelled at the words, but her resolve tightened as Langley's lawyer rose for his rebuttal. "This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to vilify a successful businessman," the lawyer said smoothly. "The so-called evidence is circumstantial at best, the allegations baseless. We intend to prove that this case has no merit." Ellie clenched her fists under the table, anger simmering at the casual dismissal of everything she and Peter had sacrificed. She glanced at Andrew, whose sharp nod reminded her to hold her ground. When Ellie was called to the stand, the weight of every eye in the room bore down on her. She stood clutching the notebook and approached the witness box. After taking the oath, she settled into the chair, her hands trembling as she placed the notebook on the stand. "Mrs. Ashcroft," the prosecutor began, his tone gentle but firm, "can you tell the court what led you to bring this case forward?" Ellie's voice wavered at first but grew stronger with each word. "My husband, Peter Ashcroft, was a journalist. He spent years investigating Victor Langley and the corruption tied to his empire. He believed in justice, in truth, but before he could publish his findings, he was killed." She paused, her throat tightening as the memory threatened to overwhelm her. "After his death, I found this notebook. It contains everything he uncovered, names, transactions, locations. It's more than just evidence, it's his voice, and I couldn't let it be silenced." The prosecutor guided her through key entries in the notebook, each revelation sending murmurs rippling through the courtroom. Langley's calm facade began to crack, his lawyer furiously scribbling notes. When the defense attorney stood to cross-examine her, the shift in tone was immediate. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he began, his smile thin and predatory, "you claim this notebook belongs to your late husband. How can we be sure it wasn't fabricated? Perhaps by someone looking to frame my client. Ellie's breath caught, but she met his gaze with steely determination. Because Peter never lied, and because every name, every transaction in that notebook can be verified. Check the bank records. Look at the offshore accounts. It's all there. The attorney pressed on, but Ellie held her ground, each answer precise, her voice unwavering. By the time she stepped down, the room buzzed with a palpable shift in momentum. As the final arguments were presented, Ellie sat with Maggie and Andrew, her heart pounding. The judge's gavel fell, and the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours felt like days as they waited for the verdict. Maggie held Ellie's hand tightly, her quiet reassurances keeping the rising tide of anxiety at bay. Andrew stood by the window, his expression grim but hopeful. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman rose and the courtroom fell silent. We, the jury, find the defendant, Victor Langley, guilty on all counts. The words echoed like a thunderclap. Ellie exhaled sharply, tears streaming down her face as Maggie wrapped her in a fierce hug. Andrew's rare smile broke through his stoic demeanor, and he placed a reassuring hand on Ellie's shoulder. Langley's face twisted in fury as the bailiff approached, his cries of protest drowned out by the noise of the courtroom erupting around them. For the first time, the man who had cast such a long shadow over Ellie's life was powerless. As they stepped into the bright sunlight outside the courthouse, Ellie clutched Peter's notebook to her chest, her tears a mixture of grief and triumph. Maggie linked arms with her, and Andrew gave a curt nod. "It's over," Maggie whispered. Ellie looked up at the sky, the weight of years finally lifting. "No," she said softly. "It's just beginning." The soft murmur of the courthouse crowd faded as Ellie stepped into the quiet sanctuary of her home. The familiar creak of the floorboards under her feet grounded her, though the air still carried the weight of all she had endured. Maggie followed close behind, her comforting presence a steady anchor. Ellie placed Peter's notebook gently on the coffee table, its battered cover catching the sunlight streaming through the window. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of peace, though her heart still ached for the man who had left her this impossible mission. Maggie set 2 steaming mugs of tea on the table, her eyes soft with concern. "You did it, Ellie," she said quietly. "You finished what Peter started. He'd be so proud of you." Ellie smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the notebook's cover. "I hope so," she murmured. "But it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels unfinished." Maggie reached across the table, her hand warm over Ellie's. "What you did today, Ellie, it matters. You stopped Langley. You gave Peter a voice when he couldn't speak for himself." Ellie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I just wish he could be here to see it." The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside. Andrew arrived moments later, his expression lighter than Ellie had seen in weeks. He carried a small box in his hands, placing it on the table with care. "What's this?" Ellie asked, tilting her head. Andrew shrugged, his smile faint but genuine. "A little something from the evidence locker. The police released it now that the case is closed." Ellie hesitated, her fingers trembling as she opened the box. Inside was a collection of Peter's personal belongings, a wristwatch, a leather-bound journal, and a bundle of photographs. She lifted the watch, its weight familiar in her hand, and held it to her chest. Maggie leaned over to peek at the photographs, her expression softening. "Ellie, look." She handed her one of the photos, a candid shot of Peter sitting at the piano, his face lit with quiet joy as he played. Ellie's breath caught, tears spilling freely now. "That was his favorite song," she whispered. "He used to play it every Sunday morning, no matter how busy he was." Andrew stepped back, giving her space, but his voice was steady and reassuring. "He left you more than just evidence, Ellie. He left you a legacy." Ellie traced the edge of the photograph, her tears falling onto the glossy surface. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted, her voice breaking. "For so long this fight was all I had. Now," Maggie squeezed her hand, "now you live, Ellie. You honor Peter by living the life he wanted for you, a life filled with hope, love, and music." Andrew nodded, his gaze steady. "And if you ever need help finding that, you've got us." Ellie smiled through her tears. a flicker of warmth piercing through the grief. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Later that evening, Ellie sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. For the first time in a long time, it felt like home. Taking a deep breath, she played the first notes of Peter's melody. The sound filled the room, rich and full of emotion, carrying with it the echoes of a love that would never fade. Maggie leaned against the doorway, her eyes shining as she listened. Andrew sat in the armchair, a rare look of contentment on his face. The music swelled, its rhythm a heartbeat that brought them all together. As Ellie's hands moved across the keys, her heart lightened. She wasn't alone. She had Peter's memory, her friends, and the knowledge that justice had finally been served. The storm had passed, and though the scars would remain, she was ready to face whatever came next. The final note lingered in the air, a whisper of hope that promised brighter days ahead. The early morning sun poured through the window, painting the living room in soft gold hues. Ellie sat on the couch, Peter's notebook resting on her lap, its familiar weight a constant reminder of the battle they had fought and won. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages, the worn leather soothing against her skin. Maggie entered with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, setting one on the table in front of Ellie. "I figured you'd need this," she said with a warm smile, though her eyes carried a hint of worry. "You didn't sleep, did you?" Ellie shook her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I couldn't. Every time I close my eyes, I see him. Peter standing at the piano humming that tune. It's like he's still here, guiding me." Maggie settled beside her, placing a comforting hand on Ellie's shoulder. "He is, Ellie. In everything you've done, in every step forward, he's been with you. And now you can finally let him rest." Ellie's breath hitched, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "How do you move on, Maggie? How do you find peace after losing so much?" Maggie thought for a moment, her gaze distant. "You don't move on, Ellie. You carry it with you. But you learn to let the good memories outweigh the pain. And when you're ready, you let yourself live again." Ellie nodded slowly, her heart heavy but her resolve growing. "I want to try," she whispered. "For Peter. For me." A knock at the door startled them both, breaking the stillness. Ellie rose, her steps hesitant as she approached the door. When she opened it, Andrew stood there, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, stepping inside with a small, neatly wrapped package in his hand. "Thought you might want to see this." Ellie raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering through her. "What is it?" Andrew placed the package on the table and gestured for her to open it. Ellie untied the string and peeled back the paper, revealing a bound book with her name printed boldly on the cover. Ashcroft's Truth, Exposing the Empire of Corruption. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages. It was her story, the journey she and Peter had started, now captured for the world to see. "Andrew, how did you—" "I know a guy in publishing," he said with a shrug, his tone casual but his eyes warm. "Thought it was time your story was told properly. Peter's work deserves to live on." Ellie's fingers trembled as she held the book, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Maggie leaned over, her eyes lighting up as she saw the title. "Ellie, this is incredible. You're going to help so many people with this." Ellie looked up, meeting Andrew's gaze. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, "but I'm so glad you did." Andrew nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've done the hard part, Ellie. The least I could do was make sure the world knows." For the first time in months, Ellie felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel: hope. She placed the book on the table, standing tall and steady as she spoke. "It's time for a new chapter. One where Peter's memory isn't just about loss, but about everything he stood for." Maggie rose, pulling Ellie into a tight hug. "We'll be with you every step of the way." Andrew chuckled, his tone light. "Just don't expect me to write another book. That's all you." Ellie laughed softly, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. She turned toward the piano, her fingers brushing over the keys. The notes rang out, soft and bittersweet, filling the room with a melody that carried all the weight of the past and the promise of the future. As the music swelled, Ellie spoke, her voice steady and strong. For Peter, for truth, and for tomorrow. Maggie and Andrew sat beside her, their presence a steady reminder that she wasn't alone. Together, they watched the light spill through the window, illuminating a path forward, one filled with promise, purpose, and the unshakable bonds they had forged through fire.